Hello students, this is the second video in our series on the cycling of matter this week, and we will be looking at the nitrogen cycle. As a reminder, I'm putting some guidelines again for how to take notes, and I recommend splitting your page into 4 sections, 1 section for each of the cycles. Again, please utilize diagrams to show the movement of the element through organic and non-organic layers, and finally, please include what ways humans impact the cycling of matter for that specific element, just so you get a real-world connection to this and not focus on solely memorizing all the steps and processes of each element cycle. So we have completed the cycling of carbon, and now we're moving on to the nitrogen cycle. Before we get started looking at organic and inorganic forms of nitrogen, let's review some common facts about the element. It is the 7th element in the periodic table, so it's actually the neighbor to carbon. Dinitrogen, or N2, is the most abundant gas we find in the atmosphere. It actually makes more than 70% of our atmospheric gas. However, this particular N2 gas cannot easily be broken down by living organisms, and this really contrasts with carbon dioxide, which we saw in the carbon cycle as being converted into cellulose or sugars through the process of photosynthesis. Why is it that N2 gas can't easily be broken down? Well, here is just a simple model of the molecule, and you can see that there are 2 nitrogen atoms bound together actually by a triple covalent bond, which is a doozy. We don't really see that many triple covalent bonds. And this molecule can only really be broken at temperatures of about 500 degrees Celsius, and also you need to have very little oxygen present in order to make this molecule break. So these are conditions that are pretty hard to really maintain in living organisms. So that's why N2 is quite stable. Not to say that we don't have ways for breaking this gas, which you will see. So let's focus first on the organic forms of nitrogen. So as you already know from your own diet, protein is a major source of nitrogen. We also have a lot of nitrogen compounds in DNA. Plants typically use NO2 nitrites and NO3 nitrates to process and make their sugars quick. So plants actually utilize a lot of nitrogen as well. Let's talk about some inorganic forms of nitrogen. So just like we spent a lot of time talking about, N2 gas is the major inorganic form of nitrogen on our planet. It's found typically in our atmosphere. And we also have liquid nitrogen, though this doesn't really naturally occur in many locations. All right, so this is the nitrogen cycle in its full glory. Let's take a look at this first step. How exactly we fix the atmospheric nitrogen into an organic form. And this first step is known as nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation is when soil bacteria are going to change that N2 gas into usable form. So basically going from this inorganic form into organic forms. So first, usually the N2 gas is going to be converted into ammonia, which is a simple compound, and then from there we'll convert it into the nitrates. We're not actually going to go over the chemistry of this. So these bacteria basically fix the N2 gas by adding water to it and creating ammonia from there, as we mentioned. Now, how exactly do we do this? It's pretty awesome because plants can't do it, most living organisms can't do it, but bacteria totally can. And they actually form a symbiotic relationship with certain plants. So what the plant does is it provides sugar sources, a physical home, and it gets the nitrates that it ultimately needs. The bacteria is providing it with the usable form of nitrogen, and they get a home and sugar. So it's a win-win situation. There are plants that actually form these nodule compounds, and basically these are tiny little structures that can provide homes for bacteria to fix the nitrogen in. One thing I mentioned is that N2 gas can be broken down in low oxygen conditions, so these nodules actually are able to keep oxygen out and basically give these bacteria a really nice environment to fix nitrogen. It's pretty amazing because in some cases plants can actually give about 30% of the sugar they create through photosynthesis to these bacteria. Let's move on to the next step. So basically we have, if we're just following along with the chart, we have converted our inorganic nitrogen into a usable form through the process of nitrogen fixation. Now we are going to do the next step, which is basically discussing how we make some more usable forms of nitrogen. So it's called ammonification. So ammonification is also a way of utilizing organic waste that can have these different forms of nitrogen back into one main form. So ammonia is really the starting point for making our nitrates and nitrites. There are different types of bacteria, not the nitrogen fixing bacteria, that are basically converting these other forms of nitrogen into ammonia. Okay? So we're just changing one type of organic nitrogen into another organic one. So now we basically made ammonia, and we want to make our nitrates and our nitrites so that our plants and other organisms that want these forms of nitrogen can function properly. And this is a process known as nitrification, and we require nitrifying bacteria for this step. So in nitrification, some plants can't really use ammonia to get the nitrogen they need, and that's why they need some more conversion of ammonia into nitrates and nitrites by certain bacteria. Again, we're not going in depth on the chemistry of this. It's just as long as you understand, okay, we have some different organic forms of nitrogen. It's a little more complicated than the carbon cycle, and there are some more steps that are involved. You are good to go. So next, let's talk about how plants that really don't have the luxury of nodules, they don't have the luxury of using ammonia directly, how are they going to get the nitrogen they need? And ultimately, how are we going to get the nitrogen we need? Well, let's call this process assimilation. It's very similar to assimilation from the carbon cycle, but we are basically eating other organisms. Those organisms might eat other organisms as well, and we are taking the nitrogen from them and using it for ourselves. That's known as assimilation, just a fancy way of saying, hey, you gotta eat something to get your nitrogen. Now, we also have to talk about this idea of how we are going to convert all of these organic forms of nitrogen back into their inorganic N2 gas in the atmosphere. And this is a process known as denitrification. So there's a lot of nitrification, but I think the titles are actually easy because they tell you what's going on. So D is basically, it means without, okay? So we're kind of changing this from an organic form back into an inorganic form. That's exactly what the bacteria do. One thing I do want to mention, though, is the importance of decomposers in this entire process. So what they are basically doing is they're taking all of the different organic types of nitrogen, so things that are coming from protein, from your DNA, and they're turning it back into ammonia, which is really important for keeping this cycle running. Now, let's talk a little bit about why plants can get sick. So if we look over here, you may have noticed your plant, maybe a house plant you've got, starts to get this little like yellow look to it, okay? And the leaves start to become weaker, brittle, they're also a lot smaller. This is actually a sign of nitrogen deficiency. So the plant doesn't have enough nitrates present in it, and it's going to actually steal some of that nitrogen from its leaves, and that's why it looks yellow. In that case, you probably should give your plant some fertilizer. Now let's talk about how humans can have a negative impact on the nitrogen cycle. So one thing I hinted at is nitrates are really important for plants. They can really limit actually plant growth, and that's very important to keep in mind. So excessive nitrates and nitrites, usually from fertilizer. When you have too much algae, what can happen is it can actually create different toxins and pollutants that can actually harm the water present, and also it can decrease the quality of the water because all of those algae are actually taking quite a few nutrients out of the water system. If we're looking at similarities between the carbon and the nitrogen cycle is that we saw all of these changes of states of matter, usually from solid to gas. And there's kind of this rapid recharging of the elements from their inorganic to their organic reservoirs. Okay, so keep that in mind because we're going to contrast that when we look at the phosphorus cycle next. Thank you.